Now it's time for our analysis. Cast your minds back to the lockdown. Not only was COVID an epidemic, but also World Cups of Salvation Army marches also seemed to be equally as infectious. Almost inevitably, in these there would be two festival marches finding themselves head-to-head in any final. The iconic Condon Celebration and the inimitable Heaton's Praise, which is what we're going to be looking at today, and who better to be joined by to look into the score than Paul Hindmarsh. Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining us once again on Fully Scored. I know that many people have really enjoyed listening to your analysis of Wilfred Heaton's Just As I Am all the way back in episode 14, and I hope that they'll continue to enjoy it in the future as well. Today we're going to be speaking about a contrasting piece of Heaton's music, but equally as evocative and revered, the festival march Praise. Being published only 2 years after Just As I Am, this comes early still in Heaton's writing. Perhaps before we talk about the music, you could give us a little bit more context into Heaton's life and upbringing to help us better understand the music.
Wilfred wrote it when he was round about 18, so just before Just As I Am. And at that time, he was a bandsman. I think he sat second man down in the Salvation Army band of the Sheffield Number 4 Salvation Army Corps, as it was called then. And when he was about 16, he became the corps pianist. He was very talented, started to write music when he was in his early teens. He had his first piece of music published by the Salvation Army when he was just 14, and he'd written that when he was 12. You can see he was a very talented young man. And according to his cousin, who I spoke to a number of years ago, she was the same age as Wilfred, and she was at the Sunday school and then a young Salvationist at this little corps at the top of up the hill in Sheffield. They had a corps piano and she called it a tatty old piano, but Wilfred could really make it talk, she said, and he sort of put all the variations by ear, so he was very good at improvising. There's Victory for Me, Oh the Blessed Lord, I've touched my finger on the golden pen. All these, Wilfred's sister told me, Hilda, told me that they used to sing. And all those ended up in band pieces of Wilfred's, having started off as improvisations on the piano. And there was another one they used to sing a lot, which was Praise, Oh, Praise Him. And it's my assumption that out of Praise, Oh, Praise Him, the chorus, came the march Praise.
Absolutely, and many have commented before how this march Praise was very, very advanced compared to Heaton's contemporaries writing for brass band at the time. What would some of the influences be on Heaton that influenced him to write in this way?
Well, he was a very studious young man. The children would all be outside in the streets playing, but not Wilfred. He'd be behind the shop. The family had a little shop, and he would be upstairs practicing his piano or writing his music. And I think I've described it as sort of tooling up, as it were, to make himself into a composer, because his ambition was to write music, not just for the Salvation Army, but to write music in general. So he was, as I say, very talented pianist, had piano lessons, cornet lessons, theory lessons, including some by correspondence with George Marshall, the Salvation Army bandmaster. And when he was 18, instead of a gold watch, which was the usual Heaton tradition, I think, he would have a gold watch, he asked for a selection of scores, music scores, by William Walton. Now, Walton was the coming young composer at that time in wider symphonic music. His symphony had just been published, but he really became obsessed by that sort of jazzy, up-tempo style of William Walton, who himself was only in his 30s then. And also he became rather enthusiastic, I might say, about jazz, which was not something I think that was looked upon with any enthusiasm by the Salvation Army editors in London, particularly Bramwell Coles, who I think then was the editor-in-chief. He wanted to encourage his young composers, and he was very good at nurturing composers, Bramwell Coles, and Wilfred mentioned this. He wanted to encourage them, and I'm going to quote this from a book on him, for the sacred charge of conveying thoughts to the people and winning men for God. That was William Booth's statement, and that was what Bramwell Coles' desire was for young Salvation Army musicians.
So where do you think that Heaton would go to explore the jazz idiom? Obviously, back in when he was growing up, there wouldn't be things like Spotify or Apple Music to go and launch into it. Where did he first come into contact and that interest in jazz bloom from?
I don't have any concrete knowledge of this. It's not something that Hilda Heaton, when I spoke to her at great length, she's now passed away, but some years ago now, she was telling me about how they were brought up. But I think more than anything else, that interest in up-tempo syncopation came via the music of William Walton, which he clearly became obsessed by. I mean, I've examined in some detail most of the faster music that Heaton wrote when he was a young man, right from the age of 17 through to his around 30. And there is so much William Walton buried inside. So he'd obviously pored over these scores endlessly. And of course, a lot of Walton's music, especially things like Facade, they're very jazzy. And when Heaton wrote the March Praise, it was very jazzy. I think it was to the Swedish conductor Tony Hansen. Wilfred said once, it was a lot jazzier when I first wrote it, but I had to tone it down. And that's how it became published as we know it now. Branwell Coles wrote back in 1925, he was interviewed by the Toronto Daily Star, and he said, jazz doesn't do any good at all. Good music must have a moral purpose. And I'm assuming by that he considered jazz and its associations with nightclubs and dancing and dance bands to be somewhat immoral and lacking a sort of any real spiritual value. So I'm assuming when praise was submitted to the editorial department in London, which I think was probably around about 1946, or could even have been before the war, I don't know. It was sent back for revision.
And over the years, there have been numerous recordings and performances of the March Praise, and it's still a staple of the ISB Saturday night programme. And I don't know about you, but every time I play it or hear it, something new tends to come to the ear. What was the reception like when the march was first performed?
It was a huge hit in 1949 when it was published. But I think it, as I just mentioned in the previous answer, getting to that point was not the easiest. Wilfred used to describe his relationship with the editorial department in London as rather a bumpy ride, because he was quite adventurous and they were quite conservative. And there wasn't always a meeting of minds. The final proofing sessions in 1948 were undertaken by the Rosehill Assurance Society Band, and it was conducted by Albert Jakeway, Colonel Jakeway. And according to the band's principal cornet, who was then Derek Smith, who's still with us in his 90s, he was 18 then, the band went on to record it and include it in their festival repertoire. Whether the march actually met with Albert Jakeway's complete approval, I'm not at all sure, because and I think anyone who's conducted this will have read his remarks on the score, and it says, with this effort, Deputy Bandmaster Wilfred Heaton of Sheffield Park Corps makes his debut in the Festival Series Brass Band Journal. At the outset, it should be made clear that this is no ordinary march, and it will need quite a different approach from that of the usual type written in march form. Judging by its reception when featured on Rosehill Band programmes, we predict, he says, that the composition will become a popular number with our better class bands. And of course it proved so.
Something I know that you've researched a lot in depth about praise is a varying tempi of the different performances from the very first composition to now what we consider to be a more normal tempo for the piece. Could you just give us some insight into the sort of thoughts surrounding the various tempo you've heard?
Well, it's not so much what I've heard, it's what I think Wilfred would want. There's a story back in 1948 about the Rosehill Band when they went to Sheffield Citadel with Albert Jakeway conducting. And Sunday evening, Wilfred went down the hill from Park Court down to the Citadel to hear the band play praise, because he thought it would be on. And Albert Jakeway asked him to conduct it. And I have this from Derek Smith, that they were all surprised how slow it was. Because if you listen to Jakeway's recording from the old 78, which will show the tempo that it started out at, So you can see that's quite bright. It's rather stiff in and rather military. Not very jazzy, you wouldn't say. There's not much swagger to it because it's quite quick, and it's very hard then to get the back of the beat feel while maintaining a martial step. But if you take it slower, you give a chance for the tempo to make more impact and to give it a sense of swagger. Wilfred, when he conducted it, 112. So it's really quite slow. It's the tempo that a Salvation Army band would march at. And in more recent years, the staff band under Stephen Cobb, that's the tempo they've been taking it. And it really does make a difference.
So many regard Praise, and I know that you've said as well, as one of the greatest marches in the Salvation Army's repertoire. What do you think gives it that status and makes it so special?
It's audacious in a way. And that jazziness gives it real character, which is most unusual for a Salvation Army march at the time. Maybe I should illustrate this actually, that sort of jazzy character. It really does swing, doesn't it? And the bass lilts from doesn't do 5-1 boom 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 boom, but it does 1-3 boom 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 boom, just like a stride bass as you would on the keyboard. And yet beneath that jazzy sound, the harmony itself comes straight out of the hymn book. This is the magic of what Heaton was doing. He was embedding the jazz sound writing it in to the music. Let me just play you the harmonies of that little section. It's set letter B, I think, in the full score. But he takes the up-tempo version and it's on the back of the beat. It's so far on the back of the beat that actually the resolution of all the suspensions is a bar late. So it goes da 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 da, and again da 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 da. So he's writing in back of the beat jazz and as it were jazz style, and then in the middle of that you've got the euphoniums and baritones with their which is adding to that sort of off-kilter sound. It's really, really clever. But the basis of it is very simple hymn tune music.
What can you tell us about the tonality of the piece?
Well, that's interesting. Again, it's all interesting, isn't it? I do find this fascinating. It starts in the minor key, and yet it's a very joyful march. It's rather sombre. Which is modal, really. So the flattened seventh there, and it's a sort of in concert pitch, F minor. F minor is perhaps one of the darkest keys. Heaton doesn't make it mournful. The main tune sounds more like a folk song, and I'm thinking there that the comparison may be with Eric Ball's marches, Torchbearer or particularly Fight On, where you get a modal tune at the to start with. And Heaton starts in a modal tune. I have an image in my head of Salvation Army band marching in the distance, and you hear this sound. Maybe you can't see the band, and it's round the corner, and it comes closer and closer. It's not a minor key because it's mournful. It's minor key because it's a long way away, and then it comes closer. Gradually closer, but then after the passage I've just illustrated, that jazzy passage, the music opens out and we hear minor transferred to major, and we have that wonderful chorus, Praise, oh praise him. It's very simple. that is our full. The band is right up close at that point. The sound has transferred from minor to major, and I think that tonality really is one of the magic elements for me of the march.
Would now be a good time to talk about that trio section, unpack the music there a little bit more.
I always thought, right through, and I first heard this march when I was about 10, and until 10 or so years ago, I thought this was Wilfred Heaton's Little Ditty. But actually, Ray Steadman Allen put me onto this, that actually the tune in the trio is derived from what was originally a music hall song from the 19th century, called Cheer, Boys, Cheer. It goes something like this. Cheer, boys, cheer, no more if idle sorrow, courage true shall bear us on our way. And that was by Henry Russell, who was an Englishman. He wrote it in 1850, and he was very popular songsmith of the era. He wrote Life on the Ocean Wave. That's his most famous song. It's very likely that Wilfred Heaton derived his own paraphrased version from, as it were, a sanctified version of Cheer Boys Cheer. That version was published in 1926, sometime after the original, and appeared in various hymn books. And it was very popular as a Sunday school tune. The text began, joy, 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 rather than cheer, boys, cheer. So it fits very, very much into the march praise. And the text of that is by a Thomas Plant, who was an American evangelist songwriter, some of whose material actually appeared in the musical Salvationist around the turn of the 20th century. So from Joy, Joy, Joy to Heaton's bum, bum, bee, da, da, ba, 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 da. Not that too far a step, I don't think. And did you notice there that the main difference between Heaton's version and Joy, Joy, Joy is that the phrase endings. Joy, 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 with joy my heart is ringing, stops. But Heaton turns it upside down. With joy my heart is ringing. And that moves us always forward. Big feature in Heaton's music. It's progressive. He's always leading your ear onwards, looking for the next bar. But when it comes to the final phrase, after the euphonium jaunty bit, turns the phrase the other way. In a way, he's confirming the ending by just upping the blues jazzy content.
Fantastic. Some really, really interesting detail there. Just a further question. I've heard it said about Wagner before that everyone's music post-Wagner has influenced him, either trying to write like him or trying consciously to write not like him. Do you think the same could be said in the brass band idiom about Wilfred Heaton's music, particularly from this piece onwards, that either composers were influenced by it or influenced by trying not to be like it? Or do you think that influence and impact on writers came later on?
I think it probably came later, perhaps more recently when Wilfred Heaton was an older man in his 60s and 70s, when his music was really becoming admired and people were wondering that they'd been missing for so long. I mean, pieces when Toccata came out and Celestial Prospect and the other pieces in the 60s and 70s. I think there are some specific indications of influence. I doubt whether Les Condon's March Celebration would sound as it does if Praise hadn't been written. There again, and on the more devotional side of things, I do know, for example, that Ray Steadman Allen and particularly Kenneth Downey have both expressed the influence of Wilfred Heaton's music on the way the meditative side of what they write. There's a little piece by Ray Steadman Allen called Prelude on Randolph, which isn't terribly well known, but it's a most beautiful setting. It has that same sort of objective character, very contrapuntal, very intricate, that some of Heaton's Just As I Am has. I think Just As I Am is probably as influential on the way the Salvation Army meditation sounds as Praise does on some of the sort of livelier up-tempo marches.
And what is your personal connection with Heaton? Clearly you've got a real interest, and as you've mentioned before, you've met him several times.
We first met in the BBC studios in Manchester, now pulled down, because he came across for a recording session of Partita. That was in 1992. I was intrigued by him. He's a very small man, very penetrating eyes, very quiet demeanour. And then as soon as we started, he was as sharp as a tack. Every little detail. I was on my best producing behaviour on that occasion, because I realised that he wouldn't miss a trick. I was conducting Besties of the Barn Band at that time, so I was able to get hold of some of his unpublished music and perform it with the band. I'm not sure Wilfred was very pleased about that, but he did forgive me later, I think. And then we kept in touch. And a little while before he died, I said, well, Wilfred, I am going to write your biography. Oh, do you have to? Was his expression. And I said, yes, I do. And so after he died in 2000, I started making preparations for that. But simultaneously to that, the family asked me if I'd come and have a look at all the manuscripts. And there was a pile sitting on the table, and we went through them. And I was astonished at what I found. There's an orchestral version of Partita, which is earlier, an orchestral suite, a little suite for recorder and piano, which became various incarnations later on, some songs, piano pieces, Partita as a piano sonata, probably more music unpublished than actually had been published in his lifetime. But it's been a thrill and it's been a joy and so fulfilling to enable his music to be more widely appreciated for the quality and originality that it has. And of course, also, I have written that biography. In fact, as soon as we finish this conversation, I shall be back onto it. I've got some of the major pieces still to write up, and then get the whole thing fettled for, I hope, a publication later in the year.
Well, I won't take up too much more of your time then, as it sounds like you need to get on with that. But thank you so much, Paul, for joining us again on Fully Scored and sharing your time, but also your expertise, specifically around Praise, but also Heaton's life in general. I know I've certainly found out more about a march that I thought I knew well, but it turns out must just be scratching the surface. But thank you so much for joining us once again.
Absolute pleasure, Matthew. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul, for your time and expertise enlightening our understanding of that work of genius.